All right, folks. Welcome once again to the Mac Forums Sunday video chat for February the 22nd, 2015. Hope that you enjoyed this evening's show. Rad Dave is off and enjoying the Oscars. Those of you that know Dave know he's a big time movie fan. And as he told me earlier, for once he's seen most of the movies that are up for Best Picture, so he's kind of interested in how that's going to turn out tonight. I will follow my usual pattern and wait and catch the news in the morning and see how that goes there, and without watching through all of the award festivities. I have a tendency to avoid most award shows for that reason, the length of time that it takes. But having said that, let's get right on into this week's show. First of all, let me tell you that we have a total of 284,641 threads right now. This that number of threads is made up of 1,563,000 posts and a total of 292,458 members to make those posts. As of about an hour ago, I guess, or close to 2 hours ago now, when I checked the site statistics, our newest member was TR Smith. So welcome TR and TR Smith and any of the new members that have joined since last week's show. Hope that you are finding some interesting information at Mac Forums in our forum run of all the posts. Especially if you're a switcher, you'll find a lot of information there. But even if you're a long-time Mac user, you find a lot of useful information. We have some very knowledgeable people. I find that even though I've been using a Mac since the system's 7 days, which goes back more than 2 decades, I'm constantly finding new information, and we'll get to a little bit of that this evening. As usual, on tonight's show, we have a couple of tips for you, both iOS and OS 10 tips. Although this week, technically, to put a fine point on it, the OS 10 tips are actually iTunes tips. So hopefully we'll have a good look at some of those. In fact, let's dive right into that. And let's start by dealing with a couple of iTunes tips. The first one of which, the iTunes tips tonight come from a gent by the name of Kirk McLaren. He's written for Macworld. I hope I'm not mispronouncing his last name. He's become something of an iTunes guru. He's written quite a bit for Macworld, written quite a bit of iTunes-related information for Macworld, and he has kind of become one of the go-to guys for me when I can't understand something that iTunes is doing. He's written some very good information. I encourage you to check out just about anything he writes. iTunes is not the only thing he writes about. It just happens that that's kind of what caught my attention the last several times. But he's always an interesting read, no matter whether he's talking about iTunes or something else. And this time, here's a couple of things that that caught my attention. The first one came from an article that he wrote for Macworld, and I'll have a link to this in the show notes. But iTunes, if you're using iTunes Match, which I have not started using yet, but I'm kind of looking into, given that I'm down to a 16 gigabyte iPad now that I have the new one, as opposed to 64 gig, and I just don't have a lot of space to store music and the like. So I'm looking at iTunes Match, both as a means of having access to my music when we're traveling, and also perhaps as a backup. uh, device, because if you have been around my forum posts for the last several months, you know that a couple of times within the last year, I've had a hard drive failure that necessitated me um, rebuilding my iTunes library pretty much from scratch, and that's a colossal pain in the keister if you don't mind the language there. So I'm looking at iTunes and how well iTunes Match would work as a functioning backup for that. Granted, now that, don't get me wrong, that's not the only backup that I intend to have, but it might be an interesting alternative. So I was kind of curious when I read on a forum post somewhere that there was a 25,000 track limit to iTunes Match. And here's the thing, excuse me, it's 25,000 track limit. Now, I'm not close to that at this point, but my curiosity said, what if you are approaching that 25,000 track limit? How do you deal with that? What's the solution? And I've got a link in the show notes for an article where he talks about, where Kirk talks about iTunes Match and getting around the limit. One limit, okay, is that as you're approaching the 25,000 limit, 25,000 tracks, the solution seems to be to create a second library and shunt some of your music over to that second library file. It's probably not the answer that some of you were looking for, but it's one way around that limitation. And I'll post a link to that article for you, give you some ideas there. There's also some other interesting iTunes-related tidbits in that article, so that won't be the only helpful hint you'll find in there. The second collection of hints comes in conjunction with dealing with iTunes 12. As a general rule, I've liked the various changes in iTunes as we move through iTunes 7, 8, 9, etc. I've generally liked it. But iTunes 12 has been a mixed bag of tricks for me. It took me a little while to get adapted to the change in the interface and in some other things. The lack of the sidebar and what you have to do to get the sidebar back, some other issues. So on the Intego site, in their Mac security blog, Kirk has posted some fixes for 12 of the biggest annoyances in the current incarnation of iTunes. A couple of them I was using that I had picked up elsewhere, but you may find them interesting. I'll just run through a couple of them real quickly, and then I'll post the link to the entire list later on in the show notes. You can bring back the sidebar, kind of, sort of. It's not called that anymore, and it doesn't quite give you access to content in exactly the same way that the sidebar did. But what you do to see it is that when you're viewing any of your media libraries that you access by clicking icons in the top left of the window, then click on Playlist in the navigation bar at the top center, and that will bring up the sidebar, or what passes for the sidebar in the version 12, in the current version of iTunes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another one, this one I have to admit, I had to try it multiple times before I noticed a difference. If you have been around iTunes a little bit, you know that one of the big changes in iTunes was the change in the get info window. That's the window that most of us use when tagging files if we do our tagging in iTunes. The window looks different, and more importantly, there were some fields that were not easily accessed in the new window. And it's a little frustrating for those of us that had gotten used to the older window. So here's a tip that you might find helpful. Okay? Hold down, get into iTunes just like you would normally. Now, under most circumstances, if you wanted to bring up the Get Info window, you would select a track or a series of tracks and do Command-I to bring up the info window and proceed with your tagging. You're going to do something a little different if you want access to the old window. Okay? You go into iTunes as usual, you select a track or a series of tracks, hold down the Option key, and then right-click and choose on the tracks and choose Get Info from the contextual menu. That will bring up a window that, although it has sort of the look of the iTunes 12 window, it has the functionality essentially of a lot of the things in iTunes 11. To me, it doesn't look exactly like the window did under 11. And I had a little trouble invoking this a few times when I tried it. It seems to me that one of the things that can affect how you are able to access this is you have to choose Get Info from the by right-clicking and going to the contextual menu. You cannot, for example, hit the Option key and then Command-I together and bring this up. You have to hit the Option key and then right-click and bring up the contextual menu and choose Get Info. Now, another thing that I noticed in the version of the tip that I read, is you could assign this to a keyboard shortcut. I have not tried that yet. I think I'm going to when I have a little bit of free time. I really just started playing with this a little bit yesterday. Haven't had a chance to test it today because I've been kind of away from the iTunes library. And when I bring up my other alternative, it doesn't show the information for most of my tracks because they're not available. So another one that's changed is the mini player, the way the mini player behaves. As you know, the mini player is a little mini window that you can bring up in iTunes and have basic control over certain things. There are now 3 different ways to trigger the mini player. And some of the things that you can do are a little bit different. If I tried to do this and explain this right now, I would really confuse myself and you because I'm not looking at that website right at the moment. But I'll post a link to that in the show notes. It's something that seems to me to be somewhat handy. I can't say that I've gotten used to it because I don't use the mini player as much as some people do. Yeah, I still use it, but it's not my usual way of interacting with iTunes. So I'll post that up as well. It's in one of the links, and I'll have that up for you right after the show. Give me about a half an hour, give or take, and it should be up. Also, your music videos. When I first shifted to, I only have a few music videos in my library, although I'm adding a few more here and there. And I, for a while, thought that I had lost the videos. They were not showing in my library. Then I realized that iTunes has changed a little bit the structure of the way the library behaves. Music videos are still, assume that you have a music video and it's been tagged as such in your library. In other words, it's been tagged as a music video. When you move up to iTunes 12, you might be inclined to think that it has been dropped, that videos have been dropped. They haven't. They're still in your music library, and you can get to them quite easily. While in your music library, click Playlist in the navigation bar, and you'll see an entry for music videos near the top. It essentially seems to me behaves as though you had created a smart playlist for music videos. So it seems like that's the way they're implementing that. So once again, what you do is you go to your music library, click on the video section, click on the playlist in the navigation bar, and you'll see an entry for music video. Okay, that takes care of our iTunes tips for the week, but it doesn't mean we're done. Okay, these two are kind of neat. You probably know them, but I'm still catching on to a lot of these tips, having recently upgraded my gear to iOS 8. With iOS 8, there's a neat little trick that you can pull now. I knew that they had dictation features built in, but I had never bothered to figure out how to do it quite yet. I've only been on iOS 8 for a couple weeks. Really hadn't had time to explore it. And the other day, I was in Messages, and I tapped the little microphone icon in a message, thinking that might bring up voice dictation. It doesn't. If you are in Messages and you tap the little recording icon that's in the message window, it allows you to create an audio file that can get sent with your message. It doesn't, you don't leave message or anything. You just create the file and then you send it. Here's the trick. If you want to enable voice dictation, do the following. Open up an application like Notes, for example, that requires text, that takes text input. Tap the screen just like if you were going to bring up the keyboard. When you bring up the keyboard, if you look at the bottom of the screen, and I'm trying to bring it up now on my iPad, and it's being a little bit of a pain because I'm clicking in something that already has a bunch of text. But when you bring up the keyboard, one of the things that is on the keyboard, in addition to your emojis, and that might be there if you've enabled that, and your keys, there is a microphone there, a microphone icon. If you touch that microphone icon, that triggers dictation mode. And you can speak dictation into the iPad or iPhone and have it appear on the screen. It works in the Notes app, works in Messages. I tried it earlier today in Notes, and it did a really good job with dictation, even though I had the Daytona 500 on in the background. I was close enough to the TV that I kind of thought that the background noise was going to be a problem. It wasn't, although I suspect that if you were in a really noisy environment, it might be. So that's something to experiment with a little bit. When you're done dictating, you simply tap done, and that brings things to a halt. It's a neat little feature, and I suspect that I'm going to be using it more and more often, particularly when on my iPhone. Because even with the extra screen real estate of the 6 Plus, I find typing text messages a little cumbersome. I'm not a good typist. I never have been, okay? So I find it a little cumbersome. When I find voice input that works, I tend to use it. And one of the things that I'm going to be setting up Next on my machine is the ability to do voice dialing. I'll go through that. My wife checked out the Tips app on the iPhone. If you've recently upgraded to an iPhone, by the way, and you have not checked out the Tips app that's on there, do check it out. It is filled with a lot of information that people who are longtime iPhone users may already know, but if you're new to the iPhone, particularly if you're new to iPhone 8, iOS 8, do check that out. You'll find some interesting information. And one of the things that's there is how to set up a situation. So let's say, for example, you have a brother or a sister in your contacts. You can set up your contacts, define that person as your brother, sister, mother, whatever it might be, and then through a combination of Siri and the contact app, say, call my brother, call my sister, call whomever. And that works, and that's good. I don't normally do that a lot for driving since I don't drive, but I can think of other situations where it comes in handy. So I'll be setting that up in the near future. And the last tip is something that my wife reminded me of that I had not really noticed. When I get a text message, I tend to slide my lock screen, go to the message app, and answer. But you can answer when the text message appears on your lock screen. You can generally slide downward, and that will give you a window to answer the message without actually going through the headache of unlocking the screen and etc. and doing all of that. You can do that with other things. It works in a lot of situations to get to the calendar app, for example, and for other things that post notices in the notification center. So these are just some of the things that I've run across this week. I'm going to be putting them, of course, on the Mac Forum site. And by the way, look for some changes there to the way that's structured. I think, as one of the other admins pointed out to me, I think we're going to be moving this to a sticky thread with just a recurring announcement about whether the show is going to happen rather than having a separate announcement each week. And then I'll just update the link to the show. And then we'll probably try to put at least the tips and maybe the bulk of the show notes, but at least the tips there so that you can find them. I'll try to organize the tips in a way that makes sense that you can find them. I don't know if we'll do them show by show or if we'll put like all of the iOS tips together, all of the OS 10 tips together. I haven't quite decided. I got to think about that a little bit, but we'll try to do that. Try to get that going sometime this week. Perhaps by next week I'll have an update for you as to that. But in the meantime, keep looking for new information. I'm also open to suggestions. If you've got a tip that I haven't talked about, which is entirely possible given the amount of information that's out there, and the fact that there was a number of applications that I don't have tips for because I'm not fluent in those apps, so it involves a little searching the internet. There's some where I've seen tips for but can't really test very effectively, either because I've got a different version of the software or any one of a number of other reasons. So anytime you have a tip that's worth it, post something in the forum, probably in the thread where all the show information goes, and I'll be happy to take a look at it, test it as much as we can, and see if it's a good one. Because I find that the more people we have contributing to the show, the more interesting and exciting it is. I want to thank you all for I've gotten a couple of positive comments over the week encouraging me to keep up with the show. I hope they're enjoying it. I see last week Rod Sprague caught part of the show. And I kind of want to wrap up this week by just briefly mentioning something, kind of continuation of something that I mentioned last week. It is amazing to me the kinds of things that you can do with a computer now. If you have a smartphone, and I'm including almost any of the smartphones, if you have a smartphone made in the last year, you've got more computing power in the palm of your hand than you had when I started experimenting with computers. One of the first computers I ever worked with was an Apple II. One of them had 16K of memory. Yes, I did say 16K. You heard correctly. One of them had the ungodly sum of 64K of RAM, and man, we thought we had something going. And I remember the journalism department at my high school wanting us to see if we could figure out a way for them to build what was essentially a database that would tell them, for every student in the school, what pages that student's name appeared on in the yearbook. Well, the reality is at that time, I don't think you could do it with 64K of RAM. That was about the most you could get. But within a very short amount of time, RAM had gone to being able to handle 1 megabyte, which seemed like an ungodly sum. And now when you're looking at new computers, I mean, we're strongly recommending to people to look at probably 8 gigabyte as the floor. Yes, Yosemite can run, according to Apple, on 2 gigabyte. I personally don't think you want to run any modern OS on 2 gigabyte, and I'm including Windows in that, because once you get a couple of applications open, you're not leaving yourself a lot of working memory. I think 4 is kind of the floor now for systems. I've even seen some cheaper systems with 4 gigabyte RAM on the Windows side. But really, if you want to future-proof to some extent, to the limited extent that's possible, you want to future-proof a computer, you're looking at 8 to 16 gigabyte of RAM, depending upon your use. So that's amazing. But with the increased hardware and increased capability, what's come with that is the ability to take that computer and use it in ways that were inconceivable only a short time ago, both to help people with disabilities, with handicapping conditions, to alleviate some of the symptoms of certain handicaps. I mean, for example, I mentioned last week some people who have experienced traumatic brain injury have difficulty retaining things like appointments and keeping those things together. That's something that some of the software that's available now can help with if you get the right application. And the important thing about having that ability on a smartphone is in the past, when you've had to use technology to deal with these kinds of issues, it required a dedicated program, usually a dedicated device, that to some extent stood out like a sore thumb, made you stand out like a sore thumb. Now, you can have some of that capability on a device such as an iPad, an iPhone, or any other smartphone. So when you're standing in line and you've got that application open because you can't remember what was in your grocery list that you made 2 hours ago, and you're looking down at the grocery list, there's probably 10 other people in the grocery that are doing the same thing. They don't have a head injury. They just find it convenient. They're not carrying 20 pieces of paper that, help them remember things. Same thing with the calendar. For years, I tried using a paper and pencil calendar. It just was a nightmare to carry around because my hands were busy pushing the chair around. Now I have a tendency to enter appointments and things onto the iPhone directly or on the iPad, whichever one I happen to have with me. I'm starting to get used to, I need to get back in the habit of using Siri. I started with it for a while and got away from it when I cracked the screen on my other iPad. And at that time, the iPad was the only thing that supported Siri. But now that I have iOS 8 on my phone as well, I'm using Siri a little bit more. Siri outsmarted me once, by the way, just as a tip. I went to put in a bunch of appointments, and I did it by Siri. And it was the first time I'd used Siri to put in an appointment. The first appointment went in correctly, no problem. It was a piece of cake. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, this is going to be great. You know, this is going to be just, this is the greatest thing since, you know, free food. And then I get ready to do the next appointment. And it would not go in. Siri would not put the appointment in. I could not figure out what it was. After a couple of minutes, I really didn't have time to troubleshoot it. I just went ahead and manually entered the appointment. It went into the calendar, no sweat. I set up the recurring reminder. And later that night when I got home, I finally realized why Siri wouldn't do the second appointment. When I gave it the date of the meeting, I accidentally said the wrong year. So let's just say that it was coming up on February 28, 2015. If I said a date that had already passed, such as February 28, 2014, Siri knows that it can't create that date. It's useless to create that kind of a reminder on a date that's already passed, and it just would not do it. So that was it. It was something as simple as an error on my part that took me a little while to figure out what was going on. So I'm kind of new, even though I've been using Macs and iPhones for a while. There's always something new that I figured out. I'm still getting used to being able to answer phone calls on my Mac. I got a phone call a few minutes ago, and the iPhone rang, but so did the Mac. The Mac was a fraction of a second behind the iPhone. So you got this recurring thing with two different rings that was really kind of confusing to my wife, who's still getting used to seeing that happen. And she hasn't experienced that, in part because, unfortunately, she's still running a Windows box. And that, by the way, is not because of any hatred of Macs. It's because of two things. One, that guarantees that I won't touch her computer and mess it up, okay? But the fact that she's running Windows means I touch her computer as little as possible, which seriously cuts down on the possibility that I mess something up really bad. And two, she has some games that she plays that just run better on a PC than on a Mac. We concluded long ago that when we're both using Macs, we have to have separate machines, because the things that I set up that I think are easy drive her nuts, and it's just, we decided long ago, although now with OS 10 and machines that are fast enough to handle multiple user accounts, that's alleviated some of it, but it didn't solve the problem that the games that she wants to play better on a PC. And as I said, the fact that she's using Windows guarantees that I touch her machine as little as possible. I can use Windows. I don't like to very often. Although I must admit, Windows 7 comes closer to being functional for me than any other Windows OS has. If what I have read about Windows 10 comes to fruition, I think I'll like it even more. I don't know that I'll ever like it enough to switch to Windows, but it's certainly becoming more and more interesting to me. And it looks like that's going to just about do it for this week, guys. I know I'm usually here for about an hour, but tonight we had a few less tips than we normally do. So I'll be checking in with you in the forum over the coming week. We'll try to get that show thread reorganized a little bit and get that up to speed. I hope you find this week's tips useful. As I say, if you've got an idea for something else that might be useful, chime in and let us know. If possible, give us a link to the tip, where you saw the tip at, so that A, we can give appropriate credit to whatever site it came from, and B, because I like to have something in the show notes to point people in the right direction. Sometimes these tips can't really be explained verbally well without the benefit of the website that you're looking at. And I have not reached a point yet, although I would like to, where I have enough time to like video these hints and stick them in to the cast. I'd like to start doing that at some point, but right now it's a kind of a time-consuming operation to do so. Maybe this summer, when summer break comes up, I can work on that a little bit and get it into something where we could do that. And I'm always looking for ways to improve the Sunday chat. So if you have a suggestion, please feel free to post it, and we'll take a look at it. And I'll bounce it around some of the moderators and admins and see if we have we got something that's functional. I want to thank you for tuning in this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I will see you next Sunday on the Mac Forum Sunday video chat. Until then, look for me in the forum. This has been your host, Sly Dude. I'll see you next week.